Thanks, and thank you for that introduction. I apologise for the unpolitically correct quote, which is from the Scottish National War Memorial, as well, originally from Socrates, and basically sums up the idea that we can know about people who have lived before, even if we don't have their fleshly remains before us, which is very relevant when we're looking at the Iron Age, for which we have hardly any fleshly remains or even bony remains at all. I have just finished this PhD, so this is the first time I've had a chance to talk about it as a whole project. It may also be the last time I ever get to talk about it as a whole project, you never know. So I'm going to somewhat ambitiously try and get through the whole thing in 45 minutes. So I apologise if any of it seems at all rushed. Hopefully there will be a chance at the end if anyone needs me to clarify anything or expand on any of the points raised. The area I'm looking at or have looked at will be very familiar to many of you: Atlantic Scotland, the Northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland, the Western Isles, and the northwest coast, of which Ian Armitt gave me a very nice map trying to define this study area. I've talked with people in Sutherland who've been rather confused about finding themselves discussed as Atlantic Scotland, and in general this sort of division is made on archaeological grounds for the Iron Age at least. This does seem to be an area that shares certain architectural traditions, shares certain material culture. And it's been the focus of a lot of study over the last 200 years, of sometimes varying quality, particularly through the 19th century, but particularly good archaeological research over the last 40 years. The settlement evidence, many of you will be very familiar with, is extraordinary for the Iron Age, some of the best preserved settlement evidence we have in Britain, thanks to the dry stone architecture. But other areas of the archaeology of this region haven't been nearly as well studied, and in particular the funerary evidence has been very little discussed. There may seem a very obvious reason for this, which is that we have very, very little funerary evidence from this period, which has been the general perception up till a few years ago. This is Webster's map, slightly unfair, this is a 1981 map, so there would now be a few more dots. He also does cut off Orkney and Shetland, but you'll find many maps do that. He doesn't put a single formal burial in Atlantic Scotland throughout the Iron Age of sort of lowland Britain. Of course, in Atlantic Scotland we have another thing to contend with, another 800 years really of Iron Age, due to the fact that there is no Roman interlude, at least this far north in Scotland. And we can study, we believe, a period of long, sort of slow cultural change over this area of about 1600 years. Obviously, certain forces did impact on life in this area, particularly towards the very end of that period, about 600, 700, 800 AD. There seem to be influences of the Christian Church, influences of the power structures developing in central Scotland, the Pictish kingdoms, and so on. And I wanted to run the project up to 800 AD to really see if we could measure those influences in burial treatment at all before the end of the period. Atlantic Scotland isn't alone in having very, very few burials or human remains dating to the Iron Age. Webster's map has quite a few dots. It's missing anything towards the bottom there. Sorry, I should use this pointer. Which have now been filled in, particularly by the growing interest in the Duratrigian burial grounds of the far south coast. But the idea of an Iron Age burial gap persists in a lot of British archaeology. On the continent, it's believed that the evidence is much stronger. Certainly they have some magnificent Iron Age graves. This picture is of the Hochdorf burial grave, Chieftain's grave, one of the very, very rich Central European Iron Age graves. But although these have received a lot of study, the fact that they don't apply to much of Europe is often overlooked. This is a fairly good map still of areas which have burial traditions. Just in Central Europe, it misses out huge areas such as Spain and far north Germany, where the evidence is really much, much patchier. And even in these areas where we do have formal burials for the Iron Age, it tends to only involve a few sites. It's been argued that even at these sites, it may not involve the entire population. They're chronologically sometimes quite limited, these traditions. And so for much of Iron Age Europe, we really seem to be struggling to find formal burial evidence that we could definitively say is a majority tradition. We also, and more interestingly for me, in Iron Age Europe, find alternative burial treatments, bog bodies, of which argument still rages about what exactly they mean. Many of them seem to have been killed quite violently. Are we looking at human sacrifices, executions, something like that? They are restricted to a relatively northern area of Europe, happily an area which otherwise is slightly lacking in formal burial evidence. We also have the use of human remains on ritual sites, particularly in France, often used in extremely interesting ways, structures built out of human bones, human corpses made to stand upright, holding weapons in some kind of tableau, some evidence for headhunting in southern France during the Iron Age, which you may have been able to read about some of Ian Armitt's work on that recently. And so the picture in Iron Age Europe as a whole through the Iron Age is a really interesting, changing one, and to restrict it just to the formal burial evidence wouldn't really give us the whole picture. In Iron Age Britain, there's a similar tale. There's even less formal burial evidence of any type. The Wetwang burial site and the Arras graves of East Yorkshire are probably the most long-lived, most widespread burial route we have. But again, it's stretching over only 200 years of the Iron Age, maybe 300, and it's in a very small area of Britain. What we do have more evidence for, and what's received quite a bit more examination, are human remains on settlement sites. The arguments over these are focused a lot on the whole bodies. This one here from Danebury, whole bodies generally found in pits or ditches. And analysis of these has moved on quite a bit over the last 50 years, from discussions of them where they were simply dismissed as human sacrifices, as war dead, as slaves or outcasts violently killed, to actually looking at the bones and realising the evidence of violent death on many of them is very slight. And now we have more complex arguments about whether they could represent attempts to use valued members of the community or other members of the community in domestic rituals and fertility rituals of some kind. The context in which they are found often seems to be associated with brain storage of some kind, and we need to look at what exactly the use of these particular areas on a site could mean. More common even than the pit burials, as they're called, are a huge amount of disarticulated remains, most commonly crania, but really involving all parts of the human body. And these are found over hill forts and settlements really throughout Britain. They're a hard data set with which to work, as I'll show you when I move up to Atlantic Scotland, but they're so frequent and so widespread and often overlooked that they do form an important part of the funerary evidence. Again, they seem to be looked at in the same ways as the pit burials, although they're less discussed. But where are these bones coming from, who are they coming from, and why are they being placed in the areas in which they're being placed? Moving back to Atlantic Scotland, a nice picture of Gurness Broch in Orkney and of Buckcoy, a late Iron Age settlement in Orkney, just again to make the point that this is our vision of Iron Age Atlantic Scotland is very much still focused on the settlement evidence. Artefactual evidence has become an increasingly popular field, and we have much more evidence, and ecological evidence, environmental evidence, have started to paint a much broader picture, filling in details about agricultural intensification during the Iron Age, and changes in artefactual styles, decrease of monumental pottery towards the late Iron Age, the increase in personal ornamentation. So all of these other areas are really starting to build on the picture we have from settlement evidence. In the early Iron Age, it seems we have monumental architecture arising for the first time, and it's still very difficult to pinpoint exactly what the social forces behind that were. In a way, the early Iron Age, which in my study I defined as 800 to 300 BC, is probably the least well understood period. Clearly there's some force there, and we have very little documentary evidence, which is starting the growth of these structures, which develop hugely through the Middle Iron Age and then decline in the late Iron Age. Artefactual and ecological evidence can add to this picture, but funerary evidence has the potential to add in an entirely different way, focusing on perhaps individual status, individual belief, bringing up other issues such as the attitude to the human body during this period and outside influences and ethnic affiliation. When I started, this map was fairly empty, and it wasn't so much that a lot has been excavated over the last 3 years, although there has been quite a lot of useful sites, but simply that gathering all this varied evidence together had never been done before. Especially gathering together all the different evidence we have. I was looking at every find of human remains we have dating to the Iron Age in Atlantic Scotland, from burials, from settlements, from cave sites, anything we could find. I apologise for the fact that Argyll is not on this map, simply because I couldn't get it on the slide. It has perhaps the least evidence, bearing in mind the geographical extent of that area, partly perhaps due to preservation conditions. A lot of the soils of Argyll don't preserve bone very well, and the Inner Isles. The Western Isles has very variable preservation. Along one coast we have hardly anything at all. Along the other coast we have quite a concentration of finds. Altogether I came up with 98 sites which have produced human remains in Iron Age Atlantic Scotland, and they're not at all evenly distributed. Apart from Argyll, which has problems with preservation, Sutherland is a very large area where excavation is focused on only a few parts of the coast or parts of the inhabited coast. It's probably fair to assume that those are the areas that would have been inhabited in the Iron Age, but still our evidence remains quite patchy, especially as we have quite strong evidence for settlement in this region during the Iron Age, plenty of Atlantic roundhouses, etc. Cape Ness, there's actually a huge amount of sites, but this evidence is very, very tricky to work with. A large number of these sites were dug in the 19th century, and contextual evidence can be extremely difficult to work with. A couple of them, human remains, were described as simply being in the debris of the roundhouse, which is a very vague statement from which to try and get at what point those bones were put there, what date they might be. Orkney suffers to an extent from the same problem, a large number of sites, but very, very variable recovery. I was trying to track down as many of these human remains as I could, partly in order that we could get some of them redated if they were antiquarian finds, partly to look at them and do a modern osteological analysis. In Orkney, to give you an idea, I managed to locate about 50% of them, in Cape Ness about 30% of them. In the Western Isles, which has had a lot of very good modern excavation, I managed to find about 95% of them, and so this is an area, although it has slightly fewer sites, from which we can glean a great deal of archaeological evidence. And Shetland has produced some very interesting evidence, but has very few sites. Again, I think this is partly due to preservation, partly due to focus of excavation. But it seems to, in a way, represent in microcosm, as I'll go on to show you the wider picture. It has a little bit of everything, even though it's all the way up there on the far north by itself. The state of the evidence isn't ideal from an osteologist's point of view, but it's what we have, and therefore it's what you have to work with. This is probably best summed up by the percentage present, which for settlements, disarticulated remains, is overwhelmingly 1%. So that's one bone, or a fragment of a bone, a couple of bones. Inhumations are better, but still very, very varied. A lot of the inhumations we have from Iron Age Atlantic Scotland were found eroding out from beaches, for example, only part of them survived. And articulated remains on settlements, again, are very varied. This has a big impact on what we can tell about the people they once belonged to. For example, looking at age at death and looking at sex, are both influenced by this. Age at death is much easier to calculate, as any osteologist will tell you, for juvenile remains. And so for most of the juvenile remains I was able to look at, we have an exact age. But for adult remains, a single arm bone, it's very, very difficult to tell. And sex, again, there's limited evidence. We do seem to have all ages and all sexes represented in the various contexts in Atlantic Scotland, but we're very far from having a complete picture. And this even impacted my analysis of injuries, of illnesses. What we do seem to have hints of is a fairly normal population, farming prehistoric population, evidence of dental disease, evidence of arthritis in old age, evidence of accidental trauma, not much evidence of infectious disease as you would expect from a rural population. And some interesting points came up. I just put this one up because he doesn't come up anywhere else, and I quite like him. A very rare, large bone tumour on the back of the skull. That was all that survived of this burial, but it just shows what you can miss if you only have one bone. We have no idea what we might have found on the rest of that skeleton. The largest category of finds are disarticulated human remains on the settlements. I think these make up about 150 people, estimated about 150 people from 37 sites. And they're extremely, I mean, they have their drawbacks, but they're an extremely, extremely interesting group. And the example I've got here are an antiquarian recovered cranium from Lingro, which we had redated during this project, generously funded by Historic Scotland, I should say. And this came out to be 1st or 2nd century AD. The site at Lingro, a complex roundhouse site, was occupied for, we believe, a few centuries after that point. So this cranium was placed in a guard cell while the site was very much still in use. This is some disarticulated neonatal remains from Howe, nicely photographed in situ, but giving an impression of how fragmentary much of this material is. A much more well-known case is the Hornish Point boy, or it's called the disarticulated juvenile placed in 4 pits at Hornish Point. It's rare that we have that much of an individual. There are only 2 cases, him and the boy from Scatness, where so much of an individual is represented. And he seems to be a very particular case. And this cranium from Neath in the Western Isles, which we also had dated, optimistically assuming it would turn out to be Middle Iron Age, it actually turned out to be Middle Bronze Age, which was extremely confusing. Our best guess is that, although it's found in a very secure Middle Iron Age context, there is an eroding Bronze Age cemetery very near to the site at Neath, from which this may have been found, brought to the site, and obviously used, which gives an intriguing idea of people reinterpreting the past, even in the Iron Age, finding human remains and deciding to make some use of them. Disarticulated remains on settlements do come from a wide age group. Children are quite well represented, and this is an interesting thing when we're trying to get to whether we're looking at slaves, war dead, human sacrifices, even high-status individuals, which of course should never be ruled out for any funerary treatment in a social and cultural context that we are not familiar with. Both men and women are represented, the very old and the very young, as far as we can tell. There are also examples of people who are obviously quite sick when they died, some examples of a late cancer, some examples of injury, peri-mortem injury. So it's really a huge range of population that we seem to have represented on these sites. In terms of the bones represented, however, there's a very, very clear pattern. The cranium was found over 4 times as often as any other bone. There seems to be a real focus on the cranium here, as in much of the rest of Iron Age Europe. Should perhaps never be a surprise. Humans often focus on the cranium. It is the most recognisable, often the most symbolically important part of the body. But there's obvious selection going on in the rest of the body. Large, long bones, again, being brought to sight much more often than the smaller bones. And this isn't naturally what you would expect from the preservation of human remains. Some of the larger bones, the lumbar vertebrae, for example, should survive very well. We simply don't find them. They're not being brought to these sites. Looking at what these remains could represent, it's been argued for some southern British sites that the human remains they find there could be the results of excavation, the results of bones being left behind when the rest of the body was cleared. That clearly doesn't work for the Atlantic Scottish sites, because what we're seeing are the large bones, the bones that would have been obvious that would have been removed. So what we seem to be seeing is, if we are seeing excavation happening off-site, certain bones being retrieved and brought and placed into certain contexts. This is my little conceptual roundhouse. I've tried to put it next to a real roundhouse settlement to give an idea of what I was going for. This is looking at the human remains in context, which happily, even if they were very poorly preserved, can give us some idea of what the intention was in their final deposition. Again, this is much easier with modern excavated sites, especially those which have site plans, those which have photographs in situ than with antiquarian sites. The Gurnett, although you probably can't read this, this is the rest of the human remains. There was simply no clue about where they were found, and there are a few hints. One bone found in the entrance passage, one body found in the back passage. They mention a pair of hands, but they don't say where they are. So in many of the antiquarian cases, it was very difficult to get at it. But with some of the more modern ones, you could really sort of build up a picture of where these deposits are focusing. And the really clear depositional focus seems to be the entranceways. That happens all over Atlantic Scotland, human remains being placed in entranceways, and being placed in areas near entranceways. Human remains aren't just placed into central roundhouses, into the central structure. They are found in outbuildings at many sites. But the outbuildings most frequently used seem to be those outside the entrance, opposite the entrance. Equally, guard cells most frequently by the entrance are the ones where human remains are being placed. These group of skulls in the centre are ones which were described as being found within central roundhouses, but no further clue was given. And the reason I was trying to split it up into northeast, northwest, southwest, southeast, as you'll see from, I think, the next slide, is that some people have argued for a more cosmological understanding of roundhouses, for people using roundhouses and thinking about their roundhouses in certain ways, and certain areas being the focus of deposition. On the Atlantic Scottish evidence, slim as it is, we don't seem to have much evidence for that. What we do have good evidence for in Atlantic Scotland, thanks to the dry stone architecture, is evidence for things being built into walls, something you simply can't get at with a wooden architectural tradition, where if bones were placed into walls, into roofs, they would fall down. We have evidence for human remains built into the roundhouse wall, presumably during construction, which is a really good indication that we're looking at some kind of foundation rituals, something to do with the very structure of the house. Also, a few on the stairs, which presumably are post-occupation, or at least post-use of those stairs, and a few in outer ditches, which again, many people have interpreted as being liminal in some way, marking the sort of passage between the inside and outside. Domestic ritual is something that's now discussed a great deal in Iron Age archaeology, perhaps partly because of the lack of formal burial. In periods for which we have formal burial, for which we have recognised religions, archaeologists have often focused on those. In the Iron Age, for a long time, there was an idea that society was somehow secularised because we only had domestic structures, until the idea that ritual and religion could be part of household life really took off. And many people have discussed it. Now, this is a Parker Pearson image, in particularly referencing Atlantic roundhouses, with this idea of the way people moved around the roundhouses the idea that some areas may have been associated with death, and that human remains would be found in the northeast quadrant, although we don't have much evidence for that from Atlantic Scotland. But human remains obviously need to be looked at as part of a suite of domestic rituals, really, and perhaps the most closely related one would be the use of animal remains, which is in itself a huge subject in Atlantic Scotland and in Iron Age archaeology. Not one, sadly, I was able to really get to grips with, partly because I know nothing about zooarchaeology and partly because it would be a huge subject to look at in itself. But we clearly have very widespread evidence for the deposition of animal remains throughout settlement sites in Atlantic Scotland, in foundational contexts, again in walls, very similar contexts to those we find human remains in. There's an example of a cattle peak around the hearth at Bornish, a very organised use of animal remains in that case, which we have no human parallels for. I believe this is a horse skull, although someone will probably tell me I'm wrong, which was found underneath a cranium at one of the Sutherland sites, and brings up the subject of directly related deposits of human and animal remains, which there are very few examples of in Atlantic Scotland. One from Whitegate in Caithness, which Andy Heald has been digging. The Hornish Point child was found in pits along with butchered animal remains. No signs of butchery on the human remains, and that seems to be a clear indication of some kind of feasting event accompanying that burial. Flocktravi, which is a site in the Western Isles, which was excavated very recently, a human mandible placed on top of a very interesting structured deposit involving some burnt and butchered animal remains and an articulated and partially charred animal body, I believe a sheep. And on top of this was placed a quernstone, which the excavators believed libations could be poured down. It's a really fantastic find. We rarely have that kind of level of information on how human remains would have fitted into a wider domestic ritual involving artefacts and animal remains. There's also the question of what happened to human remains in between them being brought to site and then being deposited, whether they were brought to site and simply deposited, or whether they had some kind of use life. Chapman's talked about human remains being exchanged, moved around communities as a sign of kinship, and believed that fragmentation could be part of that. It's also possible that human remains were used in domestic rituals for quite some time before their final deposition. We don't have much evidence for it on many of these sites, although many of the human remains we find are in surprisingly good condition. I mean, there's very little sign of weathering on many of these remains. The most interesting group are modified human remains, which seem to show a clear interim stage between the death of the individual they once belonged to and their final deposition, changed into something usable or displayable by the community that they were found within. There's a group of two pictured here, but four now perforated cranial fragments from Atlantic Scotland that all date to the Iron Age. The earliest of them, the two earliest of them, are a perforated cranial fragment found at Neep and one found at Fiskeveg, which is a cave site on Skye, which was just found last year. And these two, Hillhead, which dates to the 3rd or 4th century AD, and Lower Doonry, which dates to the 7th or 8th century AD. So very spread out and all different. The Neep fragment is cut off halfway through, sort of like that, if you can imagine it. The hole's right on the end, so we don't know what the rest of that bone would have looked like. The Fiskeveg fragment, a single central hole. The Hillhead fragment, obviously this intriguing group of three holes. And the Doonray fragment has this one large central perforation, and then these other four, called attempted drill holes, which seems misleading. Presumably they could have been drilled all the way through. They're in a very decorative pattern, which suggests, again, perhaps that what we're looking at here is a display of these items. Suspension would seem to be the natural reason for the perforation of these fragments, all of which are very well preserved and don't show any use where they seem to have been taken care of. Where they were displayed, if they were worn in some way, if they belonged to particular individuals, is an intriguing idea. The Hillhead, Fiskeveg, and Neep fragments were all found on settlements. Perhaps they were displayed on those settlements. The Doonray fragment was found with a burial, and that suggests a very interesting relationship with that person. We also have a couple of femur head whorls. Obviously, there are also many animal femur head whorls, but there are two now definitely human femur head whorls from Atlantic Scotland dating to the Iron Age. This one from Crosskirk shows youth wear on the top. There's been some debate about these, which I am not entirely qualified to indulge in myself. They seem to resemble spindle whorls, what are believed to be spindle whorls of some type, but I've been informed by Anne Brundle at Orkney that they're too light to be spindle whorls and wouldn't have worked. Other people suggested they might have been toggles or buttons of some type, although they'd be quite large. But either way, they seem to have been obviously used for a practical purpose. That youth wear has come from regular use. And the final example is this bone from the Wag of Force, one of a pair of long bones that was buried underneath the entrance to that roundhouse, which has polishing and youth wear to one end. Seems most likely to have been used as some kind of awl, but again, a practical purpose. These youth wear bones may differ from the perhaps displayed cranial fragments. We may be looking at two different groups of human remains, both of which show a life in between recovery from the humans they belong to and final deposition. They're not being treated in the same way as animal bones. We don't have any examples, as far as I'm aware, of perforated animal bones in this way. And we also, although we do have, of course, animal bone tools, the sort of apparently very purposeful deposition of this bone under the entrance to the roundhouse seems to mark it out as something that was perceived to be different from animal bones in this period. We also have a small group of whole bodies on occupied sites in the way the pit burials of Atlantic Scotland, although they're not found in pits. But there are articulated human remains found on just really a handful of sites, but they form an interesting subgroup. This example is from, I believe, Boo in Orkney. This seated burial found in an outbuilding at Crosskirk in Caithness. And here a prone burial from Howe. These two over here are a different phenomenon entirely in a way, belonging to now a small group of what are known as entirely ritualised sites in Atlantic Scotland, sites that were never used for domestic occupation, Mine Howe and High Pasture Cave. It's intriguing that now these sites are emerging that were previously known about. They, again, are using human remains, just like the settlements in some ways. The burials on settlement sites are found in abandoned areas of sites, but all of these three examples, placed on sites that continue to be used for centuries after these people died, they formed parts of the living site in a way, perhaps marking off abandoned areas of those settlements. And again, Mine House seems to have been used for a while after this burial was made. High Pasture Cave, on the other hand, was sealed up just after this body was placed into the stairwell, placed along with two infant skeletons, one infant and one neonate, I should say. At Mine Howe, a second body was found outside the workshop that this woman was buried under, and he seems to have had a very different treatment. She's arranged quite formally, supinely. She has this artefact, which no one seems entirely sure of, but is believed to be an ironworking artefact, perhaps relating to the workshop she was buried under. The man outside is arranged very informally and shows clear evidence of having been violently killed. The whole bodies in occupied sites, again, stand out in some ways from the disarticulated remains. All the bodies from settlement sites that we've been able to sex are male. There are no female examples. The same isn't true of the bodies from sites like High Pasture Cave and Mine Howe, where women are represented, and possibly, although I'm not going to talk about this at any length, from the Knowe of Skye, which is another very singular site from Orkney, which is still being examined even as we speak, which represents, I believe, another perhaps entirely ritualised site, deposition of human remains. They stand out in other ways. In particular, these 5 men from the settlement sites form a really interesting group. They're all very similar in age, all between 30 and 50 years old, all seem to be relatively robust, strong, relatively tall. 4 of them show evidence of severe dental caries, which is quite rare in this period in which sugar wasn't widespread, and so perhaps that's an indicator of high status of some kind, which would be very interesting in regard to where they've ended up. And one of them, the Crosskirk man, had this long-term dislocated shoulder, and this is a new joint was formed on the back of the shoulder where his arm has been dislocated for presumably years. This would have severely reduced the movement of that arm. He probably wouldn't have been able to contribute in a physical way to society, and yet his final sort of deposition, if I can go back to it, is extremely formal. He's given this special treatment placed on this site, clearly as in some way an unusual individual for that community. This is the cranium of the individual from Howe. Okay, if I can just go back. Which shows evidence of perimortem blunt force trauma, which is presumably the cause of death. So again, evidence of violent killing, along with the skeleton from Mine Howe. These are 2 of his ribs showing some of the multiple knife wounds that he seems to have suffered just before his death. So it's a very, very complex picture, these human remains from this site. Although in some ways we have indications of high status, we also have indications of what looks like human sacrifice in at least 2 cases, or execution. These are public sites, occupied sites. It's very difficult to see how these could be murders. They seem to be socially sanctioned in some way, and presumably quite ritualised, judging by especially the deposition of this man on Mine Howe. So they form a very interesting group. It's very difficult to know how closely these are related to the disarticulated human remains on settlement sites. They seem to, in a way, form two groups, the ones that are fairly roughly positioned and ones that are very formally buried. We're seeing part of a spectrum here from disarticulated human remains towards formal burial. The earliest formal burials we have in Iron Age Atlantic Scotland are now being pushed back earlier and earlier, happily with the advent of direct dating of many of these examples. The very earliest have now a 4th or 3rd century BC, which is very early indeed. For Iron Age Britain as a whole, they really stand alone, and they're found in the Western Isles, closely followed by these two up in northwest Sutherland, which date to around the turn of the millennium. This is an example from Shetland, not shown on this map, but dating to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. They're very patchy, there's very few of them known yet, and they're often in quite poor condition, as this eroding example from the Western Isles shows. It seems extremely likely we've missed a great many more of these early burials because of, A, the assumption that Iron Age societies didn't practice formal inhumation, and so human remains are never automatically assumed to date to this period, and B, the erosion of many of the coastlines. But formal burial does go on to spread over Atlantic Scotland in a very interesting way. Over here are the two isolated Western Isles burials, very early, no others we have yet, and they don't look alike. One of them is crouched, one of them is supine, two very different burials, different sides of the Western Isles, but at the same time. Then these two in northwest Sutherland, and then this cluster really represents Galston, an interesting, very early cemetery site of some kind. It seems to be quite long-lived, and it seems to be quite a slow rate of burial, although we don't know the exact number that were originally at this site. Janet Montgomery's done some isotope work on some of these burials and shown them to be non-local to the Western Isles, which is another very interesting point. Are we, in any of these early burials, seeing people who are not local to Atlantic Scotland, who are coming in with foreign funerary traditions? If so, where are they coming from? This is a period during which inhumation isn't being practiced elsewhere in Britain, that we know, and also doesn't seem to be common in Ireland. As we move into the later Iron Age, or later Middle Iron Age at least, these are the earliest couple in Shetland. Again, the evidence from Shetland is fairly patchy, and from Caithness, we've run into the problem of the antiquarian sites and the antiquarian excavated sites, particularly Achigill and Case, both believed to be perhaps between the 4th and the 7th century AD, but with very poor dating evidence. But certainly there seems to be burials turning up there at this point, and a few in Sutherland. In Argyll, we really have nothing right up until the end of this period. Again, it's an area with poor burial and bone preservation. And we have a couple of possible early Christian cemeteries appearing in Argyll right at the end of the period, but which I'll come back to in a minute. Orkney is the only area where we seem to see what archaeologists like to see, which is a sudden, widespread introduction of burial of some type. Actual cemeteries representing, presumably, the uptake of this tradition by a whole community, rather than what we see early on, which seems to be the uptake of this tradition by one person or by two people. And it's difficult to relate any of these to changes in wider Britain. Around 200 AD is believed to be the point at which inhumation was adopted in Roman Britain. Then some of the ones in Scotland clearly predate that. It's possible that this was gradually filtering through to Orkney, that this is the reason that they came up there, although that would seem a stretch. There do seem to be links between Orkney and the Roman world, but they seem to be very slight. Longcliffe cemeteries appearing in southern Scotland seems a much more likely candidate as a process that would filter upwards, and perhaps that's what we're really seeing with this appearance in Orkney. Links with the Pictish kingdom seeming a much more likely proposition than strong links with Roman Britain. And Christianity being adopted in Atlantic Scotland, which was the one thing I was hoping to gather by running it up, is very difficult to interpret, apart from, as I'll come back to, these two. Inhumation doesn't really increase in many areas of Atlantic Scotland towards the end of the Iron Age. In the Western Isles in particular, it seems to, if anything, slightly decrease towards the end of the Iron Age. In other areas, we just don't see it taking over as the predominant majority funerary tradition. It's also very difficult to talk about it as a single funerary tradition because of the diversity. This diversity was there from the very earliest burials, but it carries on right to the end. Diversity in orientation, where you get larger cemeteries in Orkney, burials tend to be oriented the same direction, but they differ between cemeteries. Elsewhere, all orientations are represented. And burial position varies a lot as well. Extended and supine is most common, and this is largely dominated by the late Orcadian cemeteries, which is where you get extended supine burial. But all other positions are represented. We also have some burials with grave goods, but only 15 of them, and they're a very varied set of grave goods. 6 burials have pottery with them, 6 burials have jewellery with them, 3 burials have stone tools with them, 1 other burial has a copper artefact, and the Maihau, if you would call it a burial, has an antler object. But it's not a suite of goods. It doesn't seem to be a burial rite that's being imposed, that large amounts of people are taking up, a norm that people are adopting. Going back to the late age, which is really the first time we see cemeteries, apart from that one strange example on Golson, which is much earlier. Cemeteries give you the opportunity to look at a whole community, or at least what we hope is a whole community, taking up a new funerary tradition. It doesn't seem to be the case really in any of the cemeteries we have from the very end of the Iron Age in Scotland. This is a map of Westness Cemetery in Orkney. The red burials are the Iron Age burials, the white burials are Viking burials. This is a cemetery that continues on in use into the Viking period. The burials from this cemetery are predominantly women, there's hardly any men, so can you really call it a community cemetery in that sense, unless what we're missing over here are men. Again, the numbers are very small. And Christianity and its impact is still very, very hard to assess. The Argyll cemeteries that we have from this period have no bone preservation, that's the issue. There are churches and what are believed to be graves, but there is no bone surviving in those graves for dating. And so you're left with a very difficult question of when those graves arrived there, whether they predated or postdated the church. The one site we have, which seems to have an early church and radiocarbon dated human remains, is St Ninian's on Shetland, which is an absolutely beautiful spot if you ever get a chance to go there. This is a 12th century church, but it's believed there was an earlier church. And 3 of the burials excavated from this area date to the 7th or 8th centuries. However, they don't seem to be a group. Again, one of them is prone, one of them is crouched, one of them extended. They're not orientated east-west. And there seems no reason to assume that they were there as Christian burials in association with an early church that we have no direct evidence of. There are cross-marked stones at this site, as there are at many sites in Atlantic Scotland, but these are, I understand, incredibly difficult to date. And may well date to some of the later burials on the site. So what we may have here is a church being built on a site of earlier significance, which certainly wouldn't be an isolated case in Atlantic Scotland. What we're left with is not a single definite Christian burial in the whole of Atlantic Scotland before 800 AD, which is a very peculiar situation, since we know from what documentary sources say that some areas of Atlantic Scotland were converting during this period, or at least the rulers of certain areas in Atlantic Scotland were converting in this period. So, judging by this evidence, either what we're seeing is communities as a whole not taking up Christianity, although their leaders may have been, or communities as a whole taking up Christianity but not necessarily Christian burial practice. It seems obvious from the early documentary source that Christianity didn't impose burial treatment this early with any force, that the idea of deciding how people had to be buried wasn't their priority, and they seem to have allowed quite a variety of pagan practices to continue. For example, the deposition of human remains on settlement sites continues right up to 800 AD in all areas of Atlantic Scotland. It doesn't seem to be something that either the church wanted to wipe out or was able to wipe out. It would have been nice to have Christianity as a natural impetus for inhumation, to be able to say that Christianity, a take-up of a new religion, was the reason why inhumation appears. But since so many of these burials predate the introduction of Christianity to Atlantic Scotland, and several of them predate the birth of Christ, we clearly can't rely on that, and there must be some other cause looked for, which is very, very difficult to get at in a period where we have so little documentary evidence, and to an extent little archaeological evidence that could influence our ideas about what religion these people held, or what ritual beliefs, what cosmologies they were following. Looking at the inhumations in themselves gives a few clues. Overall, we have many more women than men in these early inhumations. That's a pattern that's found in other areas and similar times. For example, in the Pictish cemeteries, or the long-kissed cemeteries of southern Scotland, there seems to be a dominance of women. Also seems to be the case in early medieval cemeteries in Ireland. But it is a very interesting point of view. When I mentioned this for the first time to my supervisor, he started talking about Pictish matrilineality, which may be a leap too far. Other people have mentioned the fact that women may have taken up Christianity more easily. Again, we don't seem to have any evidence that these are Christian women. And some interesting ideas have been put forward about women as ritual guardians, women as the keepers of traditions, reasons why women's bodies being preserved within the landscape, which is essentially what inhumation is, why it's such a break with previous tradition, would have been particularly appropriate. Looking at where burials are, again, we don't have evidence of them being close to church buildings, except for in that one possible case. Some of them appear to be quite near settlements, which is very difficult to interpret. There has to be a line drawn between human remains on settlements, human remains near settlements. But because so many areas of the Atlantic Scottish coastline have been so densely settled during the Iron Age, often you find burials are not very far from a settlement, and it's difficult to build that relationship. But all of them are found along the coast. This is a picture of a obviously more modern cemetery from the Western Isles, but used to highlight the fact that it wasn't until you put these on the map that you realise how coastal they all are, and how many of them have been found eroding from the coast. In the modern Western Isles, cemeteries are still focused on the coast, perhaps due to an earlier tradition, but certainly the placing of these early inhumations along the coast seems to be the one clear and real pattern, perhaps suggesting some kind of relationship between the dead and the sea. It's difficult to tell. It certainly does, though, raise the worrying possibility that we've missed a great many of these burials and lost them forever because of coastal erosion, which of course has been taking away so much of these coastlines. These pictures are in as well to try and highlight the fact that inhumation is not necessarily a simple primary process, that it's not necessarily diametrically opposed to the other burial treatments, funerary treatments we're looking at in this period. This is a bone from the cemetery at Westness showing gnaw marks, which suggests the body was exposed to animals for a period, either buried very shallowly, although there seems little evidence for that in the excavation report, or there was an interim period before that body was placed into the earth. This is found at 2 or 3 burials in Atlantic Scotland during the Iron Age, gnaw marks on the body. Many cultures have an interim period, long funerary traditions, perhaps in Atlantic Scotland, perhaps even waiting for the snow to go or the ground to soften, which is particularly relevant at the moment. So there may have been an interim period during which bodies were not entirely protected, and in that may lie some of the similarities with other burial treatments or funerary treatments. And this is a picture of the female burial from Kilfedder, where the grave seems to have been opened sometime after death, where the thorax seems to have been opened. The sternum's been lost, and it was first described as the sternum perhaps being removed and taken to a settlement site. It's also possible that what the individuals who did this were after was not the bone themselves, but the organs that lay underneath, for which obviously we have no archaeological evidence. But certainly there are many cultural parallels for organs being the reason that you would open a chest. And there are also other suggestions, like owl pellets in this grave, that the grave lay open for some period. Again, this is something you find at quite a few sites. Back at St Ninians in Shetland, one of the graves seems to have been reopened, the body moved, and arm bones removed. Whether those arm bones were then taken to a settlement site, we can't be sure, but it seems very likely in an area in which we know that was happening. Cremation is another layer of difficulty in this picture. In some ways, the easiest to explain of the cremations you find in Iron Age Atlantic Scotland are the very early ones. Uia up in Shetland, Loch Fable up in the Western Isles are both 8th to 7th century BC examples, and presumably easily explained as an extension of Bronze Age funerary tradition. It's always been difficult to draw the line about where cremation stops in any area of Iron Age Britain, though many people believe that cremation continued in southern Britain up until the 7th or even 6th century BC, and so perhaps we're simply missing a lot more of these in Atlantic Scotland, again due to the belief that they're generally assigned automatically to the Bronze Age rather than to the Iron Age. But there are also later burials, burials that fall into the Middle Iron Age, burials that fall into the later Iron Age, which are very difficult to explain. Most of them have only been found to be Iron Age because they've been directly dated again, and because radiocarbon dating is moving along to a point where cremated remains can be reliably dated. The few exceptions are cremations found in association with Middle Iron Age architecture. This marvellous picture of the cremation kists over Oxtrow Rock. Sadly, none of these bones survive now. This is pretty much the only picture that describes them. One of these was apparently covered by a picture symbol stone, which no longer survives. All very difficult to explain, but if indeed they did overlie the rock structure, presumably these are late Iron Age cremation graves, and a large late Iron Age cremation cemetery, which we don't have anywhere else. We also have a couple in the southwest, down in Argyll, which are important because we have so little evidence from elsewhere in Argyll and the Inner Isles. And it's possible in these cases that what we may be looking at is some form of Irish influence. Cremation does seem to be quite the most popular funerary treatment that we have evidence for in Ireland throughout much of the Long Iron Age. And so in this area in which there was obviously direct contact going on, perhaps that's what we're seeing. Putting it all together, I hope that's vaguely obvious, is in the early Iron Age, what we've got here, the yellow men are human bodies on, in this case, cave sites, in that case, settlement sites. The red bones are disarticulated remains, and the green pots are cremation. These are the two early, perhaps, survivals of Bronze Age tradition. But in the early Iron Age as a whole, we have appallingly little surviving information, really, really very little. For this huge area, and for 500 years, that's an extraordinary lack of evidence. We do have, in some of the earliest monumental roundhouses we've got, places like Dhu, human remains being used from that earlier date, and indeed most of the very early simple roundhouses seem to have remains, human remains or animal remains used within them. So the focus of domestic ritual using bone, either human or animal, seems to be present right from the beginning of that tradition. And in Shetland too, we have a very early cremation, and there's one bone which is from Jarlshof, originally described as a late Bronze Age bone from the layers at Jarlshof, but we redated it. It's come out as the 5th or 4th century BC. So again, human remains being placed onto these sites. The one site I did want to give added mention to was this MacArthur Cave, which Anne and Savile will be very familiar with, excavated in the 19th century, and producing human remains which cover quite a wide date range, but mainly early Iron Age. It seems that they were found dispersed between the layers, and it's difficult to guess at whether they were originally deposited as formal burials, as even intact burials, but they certainly seem to have become dispersed throughout the period, and gnaw marks are clearly present on 5 or 6 of the bones from this site, suggesting that they weren't protected in any significant way. It raises the possibility that this cave site, and we know that cave sites were focuses of ritual activity at places like Highcastle Cave and Sculptor's Cave up in Mortuary, was an excarnation site. The bodies were put here to decay, and from where perhaps human remains could be withdrawn. It remains just a single site, and it's a tantalising example, but it's a possibility. Because overall, what we have to admit to the early Iron Age is that we are lacking the huge majority of the people who we know were living in this area during this period. It's possible that we've missed more through a lack of excavation. Not that many early Iron Age sites have been excavated in comparison to Middle Iron Age sites, but it's still astonishing that not more have been found through accidental finds, through eroding bodies, things like that. What we seem to be definitely seeing for the early Iron Age is predominantly archaeologically invisible funerary treatment of some type or some types, because of course it may not necessarily all involve the one thing. Archaeologically invisible treatments of the dead are a very interesting group of things to speculate on, but very, very difficult. Whenever you're talking about something which leaves no archaeological evidence at all, you can start to wander into the realms of fantasy slightly. For example, the idea of cremation and scattering the ashes. We clearly have cremation continuing in some form almost throughout the Iron Age. Is there a relationship between those cremation burials we have and cremation and scattering of the ashes, which would leave no sign? The only conclusion we have is if we found pyre sites, which may not survive well, we have very little evidence of them so far, so this remains a possibility. This is the scattering of the ashes into the sea, which would leave, if anything, even less evidence, but may highlight the idea that those later inhumations are so focused on the coast, perhaps there is an earlier association between the dead and the sea that we're missing out on. Viking boat burial is an example of another funerary treatment involving the sea that would leave no trace at all. Most of the interest so far, though, is focused on excarnation. Partly that's because these treatments, which leave no trace to the archaeologist, equally would leave no possibility of human remains being recovered. We know that human remains were being recovered because they were eventually being deposited on settlement sites. And the only funerary treatment really that would allow for that is excarnation of some form, bodies being exposed on land in an accessible location where humans could get at them. Open exposure has been suggested to some southern British sites. It's been suggested we have evidence for excarnation platforms on some hillfort sites based on the post holes, very difficult to work from. But of course, complete exposure of the dead in this way you would assume leave marks on the bones we do have, even the bones that were retrieved at a relatively early period which show signs of weathering, perhaps even gnawing, bird marks. And very few of the remains we have from settlement sites do show that. In fact, when I looked at the preservation condition overall, the human remains from settlement sites, the disarticulated remains, were just as well preserved as those we've got back from inhumation. They were being recovered at an early point, you would think, in this period, perhaps from a much more protected process than this open excarnation. These are human bones with gnaw marks from MacArthur Cave, which is the clearest we have for Atlantic Scotland, evidence of animals being granted relatively free access, perhaps, to these human remains. But it remains a very difficult puzzle, and there's no reason that archaeologists should have to focus on one of these against the others. What we do have evidence for, of course, is lots of different funerary treatments. It may be that the combination of these different processes is what we've got in Iron Age Atlantic Scotland. Moving on to the Middle Iron Age, everything gets much better. The blue images here are burials, and you can see really how they're focused in this area in the northwest. The two in Shetland really stand out as well, slightly later, still incredibly isolated, especially given that we have none throughout this period, running, as I define it, from 300 BC up to 300 AD. None in Orkney, none in Caithness, and none in the southern Western Isles. Just this group here, 600 years. We also see a massive explosion of human remains on settlement sites, disarticulated remains down throughout the Western Isles, and whole bodies much more dominant in Caithness. It seems to really be spreading. Obviously, the Middle Iron Age is a period for which, in a way, we have the most archaeological evidence, certainly the most settlement evidence. The idea that monumental architecture is really taking off, really developing in this period into Baroque architecture, into its most complex form. And there are still, obviously, arguments about what was driving Baroque architecture in this period, whether it was elite status, whether they belonged to certain individuals, whether it was communities, whether the Baroques had a role in social display. But the deposition of human remains in them, and that human remains presumably from the wider population, may really add to those debates. Whether these are the results of an elite group actively displaying enemies, whether they're using the remains of the people who live in those communities, or whether the whole community are investing in these monuments, investing in these great buildings, and human remains are adding to the sanctifying of those spaces. The interesting thing looking at this map is that there seems to be a real gap in some ways. There is a human remains deposited up here in Leap, but the area where we seem to have these early inhumations doesn't seem to be one where we find much deposition of human remains on settlement sites. Again, these are inhumations about which very little is understood. They seem very diverse. Some of them, in fact, may be foreign. But there does seem to be a divide of some kind running along here. We're Orkney and Caithness, where we find very similar evidence over to the northwest, where we've got something else going on. In the late Iron Age, it gets even more complicated, largely because inhumation in this period spreads everywhere. Patchily, but it spreads everywhere. We also have human remains continuing to be deposited on settlement sites throughout much of Atlantic Scotland. It's difficult to tell whether these inhumations from the previous slide, with the inhumation spreading over the rest of Atlantic Scotland, whether it's coming from this area, whether it's spreading out, or whether what we're seeing instead is a continuation of tradition in this area and southern inhumation traditions in this period, moving up into Orkney and Caithness. Orkney and Caithness are perhaps the most densely areas of most dense evidence in this period, and Orkney in particular is a real riot of different traditions, many of which seem exactly contemporary. Particularly, we've got these three late sites of cremation, which are very, very confusing, which don't seem to relate to any of the other burial traditions. It always looks a very cosmopolitan picture. I mean, when you look at that, it seems difficult to imagine how all of those different funerary treatments, related as some of them are, could have been practiced as part of one cosmology, one idea of how you treat the dead. What seems to perhaps be indicated here instead is different groups of some type, different religious groups, different ethnic groups, doing different things with their dead within the small area of Orkney in the late Iron Age. We have here the few possible early Christian cemeteries, just where you would expect them in some ways, near the foundation of Iona. But we also have these very late cremations, something which the early Christian church does seem to have been very against, which they do seem to have tried to knock out, not succeeding. And this disarticulated body on Dunmore Vaul, dated to the 8th century, very near to Iona, very near to Iona. So again, those traditions surviving really into the very late Iron Age, and all happening in the same place. There do seem to be a few changes, particularly these whole bodies and some of the disarticulated remains are not necessarily being focused onto late Iron Age settlements. A lot of them are being focused onto abandoned Middle Iron Age settlements, especially monumental Middle Iron Age settlements. And these abandonment deposits continue right up, and in fact it's into the Norse period. We've had a few bodies which we radiocarbon dated come out as 9th or 10th century, still being placed on these Middle Iron Age structures, which are clearly retaining a great significance in the landscape. People are going back to them, and they're continuing to add things to them. The late Iron Age is the period for which we have most documentary evidence. It may seem that therefore we should understand this period best, but in many ways it's very difficult to get a grip on. And the documentary sources, of course, aren't based in Atlantic Scotland apart from at Iona. They don't cover much of Atlantic Scotland. We have quite a few references to the North Coast, we have quite a few references to Orkney, but we have almost none to Shetland. and almost none for the Western Isles, which seem to have been viewed, if viewed at all, by the writers at Iona and the Pictish writers as backwaters of some type, as entirely separate. And perhaps, in a way, that may be what we're seeing with the different funerary traditions that seem to be broken between the northwest and the southeast of this area. Late Iron Age architecture is often described as declining in some way. Certainly the energy isn't being invested into these buildings as it was in the Middle Iron Age, but equally it's being invested into other areas. We do see a growth in nice personal ornamentation in this period, all of which may be adding to the idea of a changing society, a society in which the community isn't as important, in which the individual is more important. And that's a very interesting thought when you're looking at the rise of individual burial. Again, individual burial separating you out from the community, preserving your body in the landscape in a way that perhaps before, with excarnation or with cremation and scattering of the ashes, there was no physical memorial to that particular person the community would join. In the late Iron Age, with these new burial treatments really taking over, perhaps what we're seeing is certain individuals asserting themselves, certain individuals breaking away. We have evidence for links with the Pictish South, most obviously in the form of material culture, things like the Pictish symbol stone. This is a symbol stone found over a burial at Sutherland, Dunrobin Park in Sutherland. And there are a few examples of these burials associated with symbol stones in Sutherland and Caithness, and I think one in Orkney, which are very interesting. Is this some attempt to mark ethnic affiliation with the South? We know Orkney was invaded by the Picts, or attacked by the Picts at various periods, but to what extent did it come under its weight? To what extent are the funerary traditions we're seeing there evidence of links with the South, or evidence of an assertion of individuality, an assertion of Orkney independence in the North? These Pictish symbol stones turning up in association with certain buried individuals are very interesting. We're still missing a lot of the Iron Age bed, and I think this picture, I'm sorry if you can't read that, this is cremations forming a very small part. Few remains on settlement sites throughout the Iron Age forming quite a large part, and inhumations, as we date more and more of them seem to be turning up Iron Age. It still does leave a vast majority unaccounted for, which it's difficult to ignore. This is an attempt to work out the evidence we do have against the evidence we don't have, particularly highlighting the fact that we're lacking evidence for many of the earlier parts of the funerary process entirely, really. As with much of archaeology, we're missing ideas about the funeral ceremony, which could be so important in most modern cultures, ideas about preparation of the corpse, the period during which all of these took periods of mourning. We simply have no evidence for them. Our evidence starts at what might be called the period of transition or transformation, which is usually important, how the body turns from being a member of the community at its funeral to being a body, and people making their peace with that. The idea of excarnation in many cultures is to make public that transformation. It's a long process, it's a public process, and at the end of it, it can be seen to be complete. Inhumation is a much more secretive way of doing it in some ways. It's over much quicker. It appeals to modern sensibility purely because you don't have to see that process being taken out. The process is fast-forwarded and the body is put into the ground if it's a primary inhumation. We do have evidence for the burning of the body, which is an even quicker process of transition, why it's favoured so often as a means of freeing the soul very quickly. But what we don't know is which of these other end states that burnt body could have gone to. Most of the cremations we have from Atlantic Scotland are very partial, some of them only representing 10 or 20% of the body. So there's the question of what was happening to the rest of that body, whether it was simply being abandoned, left at the site, whether only a part of it was important, or whether something else was being done with those who remained. Some of you may be aware of the site of Fantasy in the Lothians, where cremated remains seem to have been used in the household, again as some kind of fertility ritual perhaps, but recovered from bodies and spread over the house. We don't have any evidence so far of that from Atlantic Scotland, but it certainly seems possible that cremated remains would have been used in the same way as uncremated remains. We do seem to have some evidence of protected decomposition of some type, which sounds a tricky phrase, but the way in which these bones were being retrieved for domestic deposition or ritual use are coming from bodies that were, to some extent, in a liminal phase, to some extent placed somewhere for a protected period. And it's possible that they went on to be unprotected, and that's why we have no evidence of them. We also have some evidence of formal inhumation. But really this just shows, A, the number of things we have evidence for, and the number of things we don't have evidence for. We have no reason to think that any of these was not being used during the Iron Age. Maybe that they all were. Maybe that each one of these individual figures had a different funerary treatment. That would seem extremely unusual in traditional funerary archaeology, but it is possible. because what we have overall in Iron Age Atlantic Scotland is tremendous funerary diversity. We don't have, and we don't seem to have, despite increasing evidence, any kind of indication that we're moving towards one overall funerary treatment, one overall funerary tradition. Neither do we have what you might hope to have, a neat series of regional traditions, a neat series of chronological traditions, with clear evidence for changes in society, changes in religious belief, marking those transitions from one funerary treatment to another. What instead you have is several contemporary different funerary treatments, not in the early Iron Age, for which we have very little evidence, but from the Middle Iron Age onwards, a very, very complicated picture, often apparently people living within a few miles of each other doing different things with their dead. And that's extremely interesting, and isn't something perhaps that archaeology should try and simplify, and probably something that is to an extent suppressed or ignored in other areas of prehistory, and perhaps even in areas of history where often minority funerary practices are ignored. To use the term minority funerary practice about any of these is very difficult because, of course, we don't have a majority. We don't have any majority funerary treatment for the vast bulk of the Long Iron Age. But we do have what seems to be a fascinating mix of treatments for the dead, a fascinating mix of ideas about the dead, and a quickly changing picture in some areas, perhaps social responses to a changing situation, changing needs. The way human remains could be harnessed by the living and used by the living seems to be a much better way of explaining many of these traditions than a set religious code, which would presumably allow for homogeneity, sorry, got that word terribly wrong, across large areas of Atlantic Scotland. And this is really wiped out, not particularly by the Vikings. The Viking evidence for burial is still fairly patchy in Atlantic Scotland, but later when we move into the medieval period and have the introduction of widespread, simple inhumation, it's really the end of this period of experimentation and of different ways of using the dead and different ways of defining what death is and how the dead can be used or looked at by the community. And that's it. Thank you very much.